Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be at a GBS meeting. I've not been at this side before, but I found it very, very interesting so far. And I myself, I'm more from a pneumococcal world, and obviously there are parallels and very many differences, but it has been synergistically interesting. This session here is supposed to broaden the outlook, the context in which GBS is presented, so perhaps that's why I'm presenting it, or at least chairing it. And we've got 3 talks. The first is from Virginia Benassi, and that's going to be a video talk, and she's going to discuss the context of GBS within meningitis and the meningitis roadmap in WHO. And then we have Ignacio Esteban, who you've already seen, placing the GBS vaccine policy within Gavi policy landscape. And then finally, from Ruth, a more provocative piece about how we think about introducing GBS vaccine, having learned from RSV vaccine, and what the perceptions of these 2 different diseases are by both patients or say pregnant mothers and the public in general. So I've been waffling on a bit, hoping that we'll get the video up for Benassi, for Virginia Benassi. Is that going to appear magically by technology? Great. Okay. So please press play. Please press play.
My name is Virginia Benassi with the World Health Organization. Firstly, let me start by thanking the organizer for inviting me to speak today. And I'm really sorry that I cannot join you in person in Nairobi, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to present how GBS fits within the global effort outlined in the Defeating Meningitis by 2030 Global Roadmap, and how we move from evidence to practical action. As many of you know, a little more than 5 years ago, WHO and global partners developed the Defeating Meningitis by 2030 roadmap through extensive multidisciplinary consultation involving countries, experts, civil society, and industry. The roadmap was endorsed by the World Health Assembly and sets a shared vision of going towards a world free of meningitis. It is the very first comprehensive global strategy across life course, and it's a flagship WHO initiative. It is guided by 3 global goals for 2030: eliminate bacterial meningitis epidemics, reduce cases by 50% and deaths by 70% from vaccine-preventable bacterial meningitis, and reduce disability and improve quality of life after meningitis due to any causes. So meningitis remains a major cause of rapid death and lifelong disability. While tools exist, progress has not kept pace with other vaccines-preventable diseases. The roadmap represents a global commitment, but its impact depends on implementation. The roadmap addresses all meningitis regardless of the causes, but it primarily focuses on the main causes of acute bacterial meningitis, so meningococcus, pneumococcus, Haemophilus influenzae, and GBS, which is central to today's discussion. So why focus on GBS? GBS is a leading cause of sepsis and meningitis in newborns and young infants worldwide. Mortality remains high, and many of those affected live with long-term neurodevelopmental consequences. The burden falls disproportionately on low and middle-income countries. And unlike meningococcus, GBS does not cause epidemics, so it is less visible. But its impact on newborns and their family is very profound. And without tackling GBS alongside other major causes, the roadmap global goals for meningitis cannot be fully achieved. Vaccines are in development, but they are not yet available. Surveillance remains limited in many settings. And for these reasons, GBS requires sustained and deliberate attention. So let me go back to the roadmap for a moment. The roadmap is structured around 5 interconnected pillars, each pillar setting out strategic goals, key activities, and specific milestones to be achieved towards the 3 roadmap goals. For GBS, this means Pillar 1, prevention, which includes maternal vaccination and context-specific strategy to prevent early and late onset disease. So GBS prevention is central to achieving the roadmap's mortality and disability reduction goal, even though GBS does not cause epidemics. Then we have Pillar 2, diagnosis and treatment, required early recognition, access to lumbar punctum and laboratory confirmation, and appropriate antibiotics. While we wait for vaccines, quality diagnosis and treatment save lives, and high-quality diagnosis and treatment are essential both to save lives now and to generate the data needed to justify prevention strategy, such as vaccination. Then we have Pillar 3, surveillance, essential to make the burden of GBS visible. Without laboratory confirmation, GBS remains undercounted and under-prioritized, and without data, prevention is delayed. With Pillar 4 of the roadmap, we have support and care, and because GBS affects the youngest age groups, its sequelae have lifelong consequences, making this pillar particularly critical. Clinical care remain essential today. And the last pillar is Pillar 5, advocacy and engagement. To ensure that GBS is not overlooked because it lacks the visibility of epidemic-prone meningitis. And finally, let me say a word on integration across maternal, newborn, and child health platforms, which is essential for sustained impact. All these 5 pillars are interconnected, so weakness in one affects all the others. GBS prevention, care, and support are essential to achieving the Defeating Meningitis by 2030 goal. So as we mentioned, his pillar sets out strategic goal, key activities, and specific milestones. The roadmap includes 19 strategic goals, and 4 are explicitly referring to GBS. We have strategic goal 2, 4, 8, and 11, addressing introduction of effective vaccines, context-specific prevention strategy, global surveillance for invasive GBS disease, policy and for maternal screening and infant diagnosis. This is very important because it reflects the recognition by member states that GBS must be part of the global meningitis response. So as we say, the roadmap includes 19 milestones to 2030, which are organized across 3 main areas: implementation, research and strategy, and policy. And since 2020-21, progress has been substantial, particularly in policy development and research. GBS is included in 41 of those 99 milestones, with 15 GBS specific. Several milestones are achieved at the moment. Most are progressing, and a small number only have been delayed. So we can say that implementation is accelerating, but still uneven. GBS is not only prioritizing the Defeating Meningitis by 2030 roadmap, is also included in the first guidelines on meningitis diagnosis, treatment, and care that WHO issued last year in April. These guidelines provide 33 evidence-based recommendations aiming at strengthening early recognition, improving survival, and reducing disability. And they addressed the diagnosis, treatment, and long-term care of acute onset, community-acquired meningitis in adults, adolescents, and children aged more than 1 month. These guidelines operationalize Pillar 2, but they also reinforce surveillance and long-term care. For GBS, accurate identification of Streptococcus agalactiae informs appropriate antibiotic treatment, surveillance data, and prevention policy decision. Implementation of these guidelines is underway through national adaptation plans, training, and integration into health system. So, prevention is not a single intervention. Maternal GBS vaccination represents a promising and equitable strategy. It aligns with the roadmap call for life course prevention and new vaccines. However, vaccines complement and they do not replace quality intrapartum and neonatal care. Strong diagnostic system and surveillance are required to inform vaccine introduction and monitoring impact. And care today enables the prevention of tomorrow. So the roadmap succeeds only when translated into national action. In practice, this means integration into national meningitis and maternal newborn plans, adaptation of WHO guidelines into clinical protocols, training of frontline health workers, and investment in laboratories and referral systems. Countries have repeatedly expressed strong commitment. The challenge now is the operational capacity. So where do we stand at the midpoint of the decades? So progress is evident, but it's still uneven. Policy development and vaccine pipelines are advancing. However, diagnostic, surveillance, integration, rehabilitation service still lag behind. Fragile and humanitarian settings face particularly constraint. And there is increasing recognition of the need to address disability and long-term consequences, but the systems are not yet fully prepared. So the roadmap at midterm point is moving forward, but not yet at the scale required. And the barriers at these points are clear. Vaccines access remains unequal when vaccine is available. Diagnostic capacity and laboratory networks are insufficient. Care pathway and rehabilitation services are often fragmented. Surveillance systems are under-resourced. These are not conceptual gaps, as you know. They are implementation gaps, and addressing them requires sustained investment and coordination. So the second half of the decade will be decisive. Maintaining political commitment is essential. Countries must move from plan to delivery, strengthening diagnostic, integrating care, and preparing for vaccine introduction. And equity must remain central. And communities and families affected by meningitis and GBS must remain at the heart of our effort. Within the Defeating Meningitis by 2030 roadmap, GBS is both a challenge and an opportunity. But with coordinated action across prevention, diagnosis, surveillance, and care, progress is really achievable. The tools are advancing and the framework is in place. The task now is implementation, consistently, equitably, and at scale. So in these last years of towards 2030, let's seize the moment. GBS vaccination promises transformative potential. We must prepare now to realize its full health impact. We have a moment of opportunity. Anticipated GBS vaccine introduction offers a powerful tool to reduce neonatal and maternal disease. We have to keep generating and share evidence. We need to keep informed and engage policymakers and do not stop to raise public awareness. And particularly, it's important to integrate GBS within the meningitis elimination efforts. So leverage the global roadmap and regional plans to defeat meningitis in a way to position GBS within broader maternal and newborn health strategy and UHC frameworks. So let's keep building synergies together. Coordination, data, and care continuity are vital to sustain the progress and amplify impact. We need to ensure alignments across governments, health ministry, civil society and communities, and private sector. We need to improve consistency of GBS surveillance and inclusion in routine health information system. We need to keep identify practical intersection where GBS efforts can reinforce meningitis roadmap objectives. And we need to maintain focus on individuals and family affected by sequelae of GBS meningitis and sepsis, ensuring access to much needed long-term care and social support. And we need to keep fight for a unified vision. The power of the meningitis roadmap lies in its connection to the UHC, expanding those linkages to GBS, strengthen global health, resilience, and impact. I conclude here. Thank you for your time and attention. And I would like also to take this opportunity to thank our GBS Technical Advisory Group, who works with us at WHO, and the Defeating Meningitis by 2030 Technical Task Force that has been guiding us in strengthening technical exchange, cooperation, and coordination of the roadmap implementation. I'm once again very sorry not to be there with you in person and take your questions directly, but please do not hesitate to email me at the address indicated on the slide. And I would be very happy and very pleased to continue the discussion. Thank you again, and I wish you a very fruitful end of the symposium.
And I've thanked Virginia in advance for her presentation on your behalf. Obviously, we can't have any questions, but at the end of the session, we've got 2 more presentations, and then we'll have a series of questions. So at that point, if you have a reflection on this important point of integration and context, or if you come from an area that has meaningful connection with the roadmap to defeating meningitis by 2030 and GBS, then don't hesitate to make it. I hope I'm going to, oh, you're there. I've been looking for you everywhere. I was about to jump a speaker. So Ignacio Esteban probably doesn't need introduction because as he spoke yesterday, and as he said when he spoke yesterday, his name had already been mentioned 4 times before he got up. But he's the lead at Gavi on maternal vaccine and new vaccine introduction, and has been instrumental in the RSV program and in the opportunity for the GBS program. And he spoke yesterday on Finance Today. He's going to talk about navigating the GBS policy landscape, implications for global access and introduction. So, welcome, Ignacio.
Hi everyone, I'm very happy to be here again today because there are more things we would love to share to you. Yesterday, as Anthony was mentioning, I had the opportunity to present to you a couple of the considerations from our perspective relevant to the financing and sustainability of GBS vaccines. And today I would like to talk a little bit more about the policy pathway. Virginia presented to us the pathway for the roadmap, but I would like to present to you a little bit more in detail what are the key considerations that Gavi and WHO and all the partners will have to take into account for including GBS in our portfolio and hopefully making it available to countries. So as I mentioned yesterday, GBS went through our analysis, the vaccine investment strategy, so there are a couple of learnings that I thought it would be valuable to share with you. And then I would love to provide more detail on when is it that we're going to go back to the board and make a final decision whether to have GBS or not. Then I would like to provide a bit more context on this Gavi 6.0 changes that I started mentioning yesterday. And at the end, I would love to conclude with a couple of personal remarks on what I think will be critical that happens over the next years. So when we go to the board again, hopefully 2029, 2030, we're ready to present a strong investment case. As introduced yesterday, that was a quick summary. Almost there. So as introduced yesterday, this is the process that we use to decide whether to invest in GBS, chikungunya, shigella, mpox, RSV, a future TB vaccine. All products go through this process. It's a process that happens every 5 years, and it takes almost 2 years through multiple analysis, consultations, and decisions by the board to try to reduce the scope of those candidates and end up with a final decision on what to invest in. And this process is based on multiple criteria and indicators. We do it through a multi-criteria decision analysis, and I presented to you yesterday what were the key criteria from the financial perspective. But I wanted to show you how many other indicators play part of this very important decisions, from the health impact, the value for money, equity and social protection, Gavi's comparative advantage that I showed you yesterday from the market perspective, and also the economic impact. And we also have modulating criteria to try to be fair to all vaccines. What will be the impact on global health security, impact on health systems, the implementation feasibility that I would love to talk to you a bit more today, and also if there are other alternate interventions that may imply that Gavi should not invest in a vaccine, for example. So for example, when we reassess GBS, antibiotic prophylaxis will have to be considered. Some of the key conclusions that led to this final, in principle, approval were obviously that GBS is a great strategic fit for Gavi's mission in increasing and scaling up vaccines. We also highlighted the link to the meningitis agenda, as Virginia highlighted, and obviously it supports equity and gender goals. In terms of our modeling, supported by Simon and another modeling group, we were able to show that GBS could be an amazing investment when we just look into the health impact. And when we took into account our financial implications and our health impact, it also showed that when compared to our current portfolio and other potential new investment, GBS would be a great return on investment. And that is what we presented to the board. Obviously, with all our investments, we also present what are the potential challenges ahead. And maternal immunization touch point is not a new touch point for countries, but it would be for Gavi. Thankfully, now we have an RSV vaccine and we're designing the program, so hopefully by the time we're going back to the board for presenting a new decision at GBS, we will have already a couple of countries that have introduced RSV, and we'll have a better understanding on countries' capacity to adopt new vaccines. We believe we have a strong visibility on countries' readiness and how successful they have and they continue to implement tetanus vaccination, but we really want to see how countries are capable to introduce new vaccines. Obviously, from the cost perspective, beyond the procurement cost perspective that we'll have to take into account when the moment comes, we all know that in order to achieve high coverage for a maternal vaccine, and this also applies to RSV, a continued investment in health system strengthening is needed, together with the coordination between ANC and EPI. And in terms of feasibility, this is the other point that obviously is we need a strong, not only integration, but mostly coordination between ANC and EPI to identify what is the best delivery strategy for each country. And from all the criteria, I really want to stop on the implementation feasibility to show you what are the criteria that we usually take into account to assess in the future how feasible will be actually to introduce this vaccine. So we look into the ease of supply chain integration, if there's any need for a healthcare worker behavior change from a training perspective, how feasible is the vaccination time point, if countries and Gavi also has experience in that time point, what is the potential acceptability in the target population, the availability from burden of disease data to inform the programs, and lastly, if there's going to be any need for diagnostics in order to implement the program. So as you can potentially see from the colors on the right, overall it was concluded that it will be feasible to implement the GBS program, and we're seeing that from the learnings from the early potential implementers for RSV, but obviously a couple of challenges remain that will have to be addressed. So all this multiple criteria decision analysis concluded in a scoring that allows us to compare different investments. So just to give you an example of where GBS landed in the VIS 2024, it ranked very well, and all of this evidence was that led to, in July 2024, to the board to give this in principle approval for RSV. So as next step, because I stopped and highlighted in principle, and because there is more text after the approval, I would like to do a little deep dive on what this in principle approval means and what are the triggers that will have to be met in order for us to reassess a potential investment. So just to go back to what an in principle decision is, and this goes back to what the vaccine investment strategy is for. So to give you another example, we also have an in principle approval for a future TB vaccine for adults and adolescents. We all know we don't have that vaccine yet, but you can all probably imagine why it is so important that Gavi makes a decision to send the signal for everyone, countries, donors, manufacturers, in order to start preparing for this vaccine to come. And as I was mentioning, and we'll see in the next slide, there are a couple of conditions and criteria that have to be met. And when those conditions are met or are about to be met, we bring a new investment case to the board so that hopefully they can give us the final approval and we can start the program design and include it in our menu. A couple of more examples. RSV was actually approved 8 years ago through the vaccine investment strategy because there were high hopes at that moment that we're going to have a maternal vaccine. As you all may know, the maternal vaccine at that time failed to meet the efficacy endpoint, but it already served a very strong signal to everyone that if a vaccine comes and is effective and is licensed, SAGE, WHO recommended and pre-qualified, we'll be able to make that investment. And last year, because all those conditions were ready, we went back to the board and got that final approval. Another example is Mpox. It also went through the VIS 2024. We got an in-principle approval, and last year we went back to the board because those conditions were met, and we are now designing the program with WHO and the ICG mechanism to include it as one of our 5 global stockpiles for vaccine. So for GBS, we're ready to show you some of the key conditions that will have to be met. So obviously we'll need a licensed vaccine. This will have to be SAGE WHO recommended. We'll need WHO pre-qualification, a reliable supply base for low-income countries, and it also will have to meet the financial assumptions that we made through the analysis, but that we can also update moving on based on the updated context as well. So we're not ready to include any check mark next to these key conditions, but hopefully in the future meetings we're able to show you an updated slide. This is our illustrative timeline ahead, and this speaks to the point that I was mentioning on my talk yesterday, when speaking to the possibility that GBS probably won't be introduced over the next strategic period, but it most likely looks like a vaccine that we'll have ready to introduce in Gavi 7.0. So hopefully, if we have a SAGE recommendation and WHO recommendation in 2029, 2030, when the committee is ready to make a decision, and if there's any SAGE chair or member here to put some pressure on that timely recommendation, it would be very important, so that after that we can have a timely decision by Gavi, and hopefully as soon as Gavi 7.0 starts, we'll be ready to start the program. So then I wanted to move on to a couple of shifts that we're making in Gavi 6.0 that might be relevant for our future GBS programs. I mentioned a couple of them yesterday, and I will reinforce some of them today as well. So in terms of vaccines, as you saw my slide yesterday, we have an increased portfolio, and it's the largest portfolio we have ever provided to Gavi countries, with around 24 vaccines. In this context, VPOP, vaccine prioritization optimization of their portfolio, will be immensely critical. We're also improving our vaccine campaign effectiveness, and we also have new mechanisms to respond to outbreaks and pandemics with our first response fund, as we did for the Mpox emergency in 2024. We're also focusing on health system strategy with a new strategy, trying to prioritize mixed communities and also continue building communities and capacity in countries, and also a new fragile and humanitarian approach for those countries that need it. And in terms of sustainability, we have updated our eligibility threshold. We have introduced caps to the co-financing increases for countries, and we also added co-financing to the the rollout of vaccines, and also waivers for countries in humanitarian crisis, all with the objective overall to increase sustainability of countries. And one of the key changes that I would love to discuss with you again is this concept of one vaccine budget. And it's a way to provide countries the decision power to make, with the full visibility for the next 5 years funding, the decision on what they're gonna prioritize, the same with the cash that will come with these vaccine programs in order to support the health systems, cold chain, or whatever they would prefer to use that money in order to have successful and programs. So, as I mentioned yesterday, we're moving from a context where countries would be able to apply to all the vaccines they would want to and would be capable to introduce, to a context where they have a ceiling. So as you can imagine, as we also discussed yesterday, in this context, supporting countries for vaccine prioritization and optimization will be immensely critical. And I strongly believe that everyone here has a role in supporting their countries in doing the right decision with the precise evidence to do so. In terms of prioritization, to decide which diseases to prevent, looking into new vaccine introductions, making sure their NITAGs are ready and have the evidence to make those decisions, and also optimization. There is a great opportunity for countries to look into their existing portfolio and look into different presentations, products and schedule in order to try to look for efficiencies and maximize the health impact of their products. The Alliance will be supporting this effort through many ways, and some of them are summarized in the slide, and some of them are already available online. It will be happening throughout 2026 as Gavi countries start planning for their new grants or reprogramming of existing grants. So to conclude, I wanted to highlight a couple of topics that from my perspective are critical for us in a few years from now, go back to the board and have this final approval. I had the privilege in this past 4 years to lead the analysis behind 5 vaccines that are now included in the portfolio. So this is kind of a reflection of my experience presenting new investment case. Some of them were approved, like these 5 vaccines, but some of them weren't. So here are some of my learnings of what, from my perspective, will be required for us to get that final approval. Awareness of evidence we know will be critical. We need strong NITECs that know what GBS are and have the sufficient evidence to make an updated decision. We need to have a better understanding on the capability of countries to introducing new vaccine. As we know, we all know the country's capacity to deliver tetanus vaccination, but we don't know how ready they are and how successful they will introduce a new vaccine. We need to have summarized learnings from previous maternal immunizations. There is a great report from the Task Force for Global Health from last year summarizing the learnings from South America and other high-income countries introducing or planning to introduce RSV, but we also need to do the same learnings for low-income countries introducing maternal vaccination. We also had to have a better and a strong understanding of GBS so that anyone, any stakeholder, any donor, any partner, any country representative, when they hear GBS, they know we're talking about a bacteria, not about Guillain-Barré syndrome, for example. And we need a better understanding on where the surveillance for GBS is. From the policy perspective, we all know that Gavi follows the normative guidance from WHO and SAGE, so as soon as the evidence becomes available, a timely policy will be critical for us to make the final decision and include it in our portfolio. And also we need SAGE and all the policy committees and even the country decision makers to consider different possibilities in this new funding environment to take into account different efficiencies that could be made in terms of the delivery of the program. And to conclude, from the market and supply perspective, we continuously need, and as discussed yesterday, manufacturers are committed to provide sufficient supply and also an affordable vaccine so that they'll be able to give us a tier pricing so that hopefully we can make the vaccine available to everyone. And with that, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ignacio. We're going to have the 2 talks concurrently, and then we'll have questions at the end of that. So our next speaker is Ruth Karron. You can come on up, Ruth. She's Professor of Pediatrics and International Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and she's been working on vaccine evaluation and vaccine development in respiratory viruses, particularly RSV, for many decades, and is a great contributor to WHO as a member of the GBS Technical Advisory Group, as Deputy Chair of PDVAC, Chair of PDVAC, and as a member of SAGE. So Ruth has also been investigating the platform for introduction of maternal vaccines for RSV, but also for GBS, and she's going to share some of her insights of that MIRI, the Maternal Immunization Readiness Initiative. Over to you, Ruth.
Great. So thank you so much, Anthony, and thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me. I have to admit that I was delighted and completely surprised to be invited to speak because I am no GBS expert. But it was explained to me that I might reflect on some of our learnings from RSV vaccine implementation that might inform how we think about GBS going forward. And I also thought, as Anthony alluded to, we have a recently completed maternal immunization project that might provide some insight. In keeping with the theme of this meeting, evidence to action, I thought I'd start with some food for thought, but end with two very practical suggestions. And I'm going to explain about the bouquets as we go forward. Not that far forward. Oh my goodness. There, okay. So just a couple of words about this MIRI project. MIRI stands for Maternal Immunization Readiness Initiative. This was a project that was funded by the Gates Foundation and was conducted starting in the pandemic and completed last year. There were really three parts to this project. The first was development of an online tracker for maternal immunization, maternal COVID-19 vaccine immunization policy. The second was a tool to assess health facility readiness for maternal immunization. This was led by JPIGO, and this tool has actually already been incorporated by the Kenyan Ministry of Health. And then the third, which is really what I'm going to talk about today, is a project that was led by Professor Rupali Lemay, which was about gathering insights on knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors relevant to maternal immunization and to design communication strategies. So for today, I'm going to focus on studies that we completed in Kenya in two areas, in Nakuru and in Mombasa counties, with about 60 participants in all, including pregnant and lactating women, healthcare workers, policymakers, and community members. So the methods for this was a mixed methods cross-sectional study. There were both in-depth interviews and surveys completed. And so the first question was about RSV, and the question was, have you heard the term RSV? Have you ever heard of RSV? And the answer from most people was no, and all the people who said yes were healthcare workers. But then when a video was shown of a baby with RSV who was wheezing, who had chest wall indrawing and intercostal retractions, and the question was asked, have you ever seen disease like this before? Do you know this disease? Then in that case, the answer was yes. 95% of interviewees said yes. And so then the question was, so what do you call this disease? And there were a lot of terms. All of them, as you can see, pneumonia happened to be the most common term, but all of them referred to respiratory illness. Essentially, this is a single syndrome of varying degrees of severity, a single bloom, if you will. The other thing about that to say is not only is RSV, does it cause a single, set of diseases, a single syndrome, but it's a big contributor to the broader definition of all-cause pneumonia. So this particular study is a monoclonal antibody, nirsevimab, looking at not only the effects on RSV, lower tract illness, and hospitalization, but on all-cause hospitalization. And you can see it's a big contributor. I understand we don't have published yet data on maternal vaccine, but I understand that very similar information is forthcoming for the maternal vaccine. And so, the problem here is not recognition of the disease. The problem here is branding. What do you call this? And so once you decide on what you want to call this, which, by the way, could differ for different countries, then there's a really straightforward message that you can deliver to pregnant women, to healthcare providers, and to policymakers. So what about GBS? Well, a little bit different. So first of all, this is a smaller sample size, I will admit, but none of the pregnant or lactating women had ever heard of GBS. A few community members had, and a few more policymakers. And as I think alluded to in previous sessions, more healthcare providers had heard of this, but I think this quote is actually representative of what we heard from some healthcare providers, which is, I remember this from medical school, but we come here and practice and we kind of forget about it. Maybe we test if we have premature rupture of membranes, but we're not specifically looking for GBS. We just simply don't concentrate on this disease very much. So the other issue with GBS is it's not a single syndrome, as you can see from this, what is now, I think, the iconic image for GBS. It leads to a multitude of diseases, a varied bouquet, if you will. And the other issue is, although it leads to this multitude of diseases, if you look at the proportional contribution to each disease, and I just for the GBS experts out there, please don't hold me to these absolute percentages. It's meant to mostly be illustrative, but it's a smaller proportion of each of these diseases. There's substantial uncertainty about estimates. There's a sense that there's probably geographic heterogeneity. And so this leads, I think, to a much more complex message for pregnant women, for healthcare providers and policymakers. I have no doubt that the MIRI Consortium, along with other colleagues, is going to solve this and figure out how to communicate about this. I will say that I think it's helpful that RSV is coming first, because I think to crack that problem and figure out effective communication for that will, I think, help guide how you approach GBS. So I said that I would end with just a couple of very practical, actionable recommendations. And the first is around thinking about how you communicate, what your policy will be for timing of immunization, but also how you communicate about timing of immunization. And as I think many of you know, for maternal RSV, the current recommendation is to administer anytime during the 3rd trimester up until the time of birth. And as somebody who is on the SAGE RSV working group, I take full responsibility with others for that recommendation. And it was really meant to be, it was a practical and very intentionally inclusive recommendation so that women would not be missed. But, our RSV meeting was just last week, and there were data presented from the UK that really showed, not surprisingly, that you really need, for maximum efficacy, you really need at least 2 weeks between immunization and birth, presumably for adequate transplacental transfer. So I think, obviously, you're going to want to assess whether a similar interval is needed for GBS. And of course, with GBS, there's the added consideration of prevention of preterm birth. So, I think the messaging, new messaging perhaps around RSV will be as early as in the 3rd trimester as is practical. That's what I think the message should be for RSV. And I think we'll have to think about the optimal timing of GBS. It might be as early in the 3rd trimester as practical, or honestly late in the 2nd trimester. So I want to just conclude with talking about co-administration. And this is an issue that's come up several times during this meeting. And specifically, I want to hone in on potential co-administration of RSV and GBS vaccines. And I just need to point out that at this point, there are no published available data on co-administration of RSV and Tdap or RSV and influenza in pregnancy. It doesn't exist. So all of our recommendations about co-administration are extrapolated either from women who are not pregnant, or in the case of influenza, they're actually extrapolated from older adults. I think of this as a real problem and a deficiency, and something that I think we should correct as we go forward with GBS. Why do you need to generate co-administration data during pregnancy? I've sort of grayed out this antibody responses issue because honestly, I think that's likely a very minor issue. I think all the data that we have so far suggests that pregnant women generate, levels of antibody when immunized that are comparable to non-pregnant women. But there are other reasons. One is certainly when we think about GBS, mothers are also a target population for immunization. They will benefit, they can benefit as their babies can, so we need to know, what their antibody responses are when these vaccines are given together. The other thing is that if we see diminution in responses to either vaccine, it's possible, in fact, that active transport across the placenta may help compensate for some of that diminished response in the mother. It will depend. It depends certainly on IgG subclasses and other things. I think when you do a study that both maternal and cord blood titers are going to be critical study components. And the other piece of this is, I've talked about communication around RSV, I've talked about communication around GBS. I think ultimately it's going to be easiest to communicate to pregnant moms. We have a package of interventions that are going to help you and your child, to keep you healthy, to keep your baby healthy. These could be RSV and GBS vaccines, and actually non-vaccine interventions during pregnancy. Not things that necessarily are all going to be given at the same time, but things that all can be thought of as preventive measures. So I just wanted to conclude with my thanks certainly to Rupali Lemay, who led a lot of the communications work, and to our colleagues, other colleagues who were involved, some of whom are here today. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruth. You might need, you've got plenty of those there. Great. So we haven't got very long. We've kept to time, but I think we started late. So if there are questions, don't hesitate to get up. Get to the microphones straight away. The people on this side, not being very active, over to the microphones, because otherwise our coffee will be delayed. Let's start over here. Roberto.
Can you hear? Yeah. So I have a question for Dr. Esteban. So could you elaborate more what will happen between the end of phase 3 for a GBS study based on, let's say, risk reduction, probability, and the SAGE meeting? I mean, will the SAGE base its decision on the phase 3 data only, or would you expect also effectiveness data to be required?
Which is a great question. This is something that we assess through the vaccine investment strategy. So at Gavi, all our investment decisions follow WHO normative guidance and SAGE recommendations. So if SAGE is ready to make a global recommendation to introduce GBS in Gavi-eligible countries with the phase 3 data, we would follow that. If not, as experienced with other programs, we would have to wait until WHO provides that guidance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-on question? Because I have a burning question about this. Obviously, with the change in Gavi to CVBs, country vaccine budgets, it's not just a matter of persuading SAGE to make a recommendation. It's a matter of countries deciding on the strength of evidence in their own country. And so how do you anticipate this playing out? That countries will have a budget they can spend on one vaccine or another, and they'll be looking at the evidence locally. And we've heard a good deal in the last few days about the absence of evidence. Is there an urgent requirement for more evidence, or how do you see this, and what are the main competitors at NITAG level?
Yeah, I think I'm building on the discussion from yesterday on equity and what is the role of everyone. From our perspective, our main goal is to make it available. We are in a different landscape now where we cannot go to the countries and say, you have to introduce HPV and you need to reach this coverage. Here is the funding you have for it. We'll talk about it in a year and you need to show the progress. We're in a different context where, because of this funding concern, we also had to change the model. So again, our objective is to make it available and support countries with the vaccine prioritization to try to make the best informed decision, but that is not just a Gavi effort as a secretariat, but an effort from Gavi as an alliance with countries in order to try to make those the best decision possible.
Great. Bill Hausdorff.
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to imagine, this is my first ISOD, and it's really interesting, but I'm trying to imagine coming back to ISOD in 6 or 8 years. And I could see a couple scenarios, and one is RSV and GBS really have gotten out there, and they're really being introduced. This is great. The maternal package, the RSV paved the way, as people have been saying. But a second scenario is they kind of competed with each other in a way in NITAG land. And I'm wondering, it's actually a real question, it's not rhetorical, and I know you're probably thinking, I know what he's going to go, Tor. I'm wondering whether if we came back in 8 years, when we come back in 8 years, people will say, God, we should have said we needed a combination. Because that is the pediatric story with some vaccines, as we know, with Hib, that was the story. Unless you had that pentavalent, Hib was not going anywhere. So I'm a little surprised that, everybody, that we're shying away. You said the word once, I think, Ignacio, which is good, but we've also talked about this. I'm a little surprised that we're not throwing that out there, not necessarily, not to distract, not to say we wait till we have a combo before we do anything, but at least as a signal to manufacturers that this would be really good, if we think that's true, if we think that is potentially something that would accelerate, so that they know. And it was brought up with tetanus briefly, but it got into co-administration. So given the plethora of vaccines that are coming, I'm just sort of wondering whether at least that should be thrown out there as something that's potentially desirable, or whether you really think that's not really going to be the issue with these vaccines. This is a question to Ruth or Ignacio or Anthony or anybody in the audience.
Well, so two things. One is Bill, I think your question made me think about the sort of, I understand that Gavi is not in the position of marketing the vaccines. They're offering the vaccines. But the truth is, for countries with a fixed budget for implementation, if you are getting a health system ready to offer RSV, the incremental additional cost of adding GBS to that system is not, there's probably a bigger investment required to introduce that first vaccine. And I wonder if there is a way that Gavi, when the time comes, can, make that apparent to countries. Maybe it will be apparent to many countries, but perhaps not all. I was just going to say that there are many representatives from a manufacturer here who could consider the issue of combination vaccine, and I wouldn't, in my view, bill it. To me, it might be a natural combination. As you said, I wouldn't delay introduction waiting for a combination, but I think it might be interesting, and manufacturers might want to comment on that.
I think Steve is next.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to follow up on your question, Anthony, actually, because it strikes me that Gavi is asking countries to make decisions with limited evidence, and I think it will be hard to predict what priorities they pick. So I'm wondering, one, whether consideration is being given to a tool that people can use, or a resource database that might have not data from every country, but other countries in the region that people could use to make decisions. And secondly, I'm wondering what the impact of this new model is on manufacturers. The advanced market commitment is really one of the keystones of initial Gavi commitments. And now manufacturers will not have a reliable prediction, potentially, on what supply they need to have available. So how do you deal with that? Thank you.
Happy to start. So first of all, I would like to start with another message, a more optimistic message, because I think it's needed because we've been talking about the shortages in our replenishment and that this change in the model. We also have to be conscious that we were able to get 10 billion for supporting low-income countries for the next 5-year vaccination. And it's the most we have ever achieved. And with that, we're gonna save millions of lives. Obviously, there are more vaccines available. There's a country interest in demand that has increased. There's an increase in target population, so we need to reach 12 billion, and hopefully maybe we will in the next years. But I think that message is still very important. Gavi will continue to play a very critical role vaccinating and helping countries vaccinate. And it's because of this increase in vaccines in the portfolio that this vaccine prioritization of this immunization has been on the agenda from the alliance perspectives and countries for many years now. It doesn't just reappear for the funding constraint. Obviously, now it's more important than ever. So there are several tools available online that WHO and UNICEF will be discussing with countries. There is a global NITAG network, there is the evidence vaccine compendium online, and there is a new vaccine introduction tool that is ready to support countries in order to make that prioritization. We will also be providing to countries when and as soon as we tell them how much funding they will have with a budget simulation tool for them to have an illustrative view of what their decisions may imply as well.
It's a substantial change, but a challenge and a good one, I think. We're really running out of time, so if, Fiona, your question is less than 15 seconds long, please shoot. If not, we'll go straight to coffee.
I'm sure it will be. 5 seconds already taken, Anthony. Yeah, so I'm a little bit less optimistic, I guess, in terms of this particular vaccine. And I think because, you know, Ruth, you really highlighted how visible pneumonia is, or RSV, or whatever you want to call it, for parents. Whereas GBS, as we call it, GBS is not. Even if you go looking for it, high-income countries, great data, South Africa too, but very few countries have such good data, and even if you go looking for it, it's still going to be hard to find it because of all the antibiotic use, etc. So I think it needs to be repackaged in the context of neonatal sepsis, because neonatal sepsis is one of the biggest reasons, particularly in higher mortality settings, of a cause of death, particularly in the first year of life. But we haven't heard how GBS fits in that, because that's what paediatricians see, that's what NITAGs will understand, even if you haven't got culture confirmed or whatever, but you can at least try and estimate in the context of what's killing most of your children in the first week of life and under 5 mortality. That's a better way, I think, to sort of package it and raise awareness, because otherwise I think I'm very worried about it's just so invisible, I think.
You agree?
Agree. I guess, can I ask a quick question? Would you say neonatal sepsis and preterm birth, or is it? I'm just wondering whether it's a proportionate issue or whether you would just go with sepsis alone.
I think all those syndromes actually would, yeah, absolutely great. But again, you know, as we know, stillbirths aren't counted. Often preterm births may not be, you know, in the national indicator plan and things. So, but definitely, all that you can get to help make a case, I think, is really valuable.
So, Fiona, the NITAGs want to hear about the disease they see because many of them are paediatricians.
The syndrome,
but the modelers tell us that it's the other elements, the preterm births and the stillbirths, that are going to drive the QALYs. It's going to be a complicated message. Anyway, we must close the session because it's coffee. Thank you very much to our 3 speakers. And thank you very much for a very active question session.